Delighted to be moderating this panel. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. I'm actually going to let our panelists introduce themselves and tell you a little bit briefly about why they're here. I admire all of these women. They are every day engaging in producing really fundamentally countercultural media that's designed to change the world. So I'm very proud to be sitting at the table with them. We have here Elizabeth Plank, who's at the end, and she is the senior correspondent for Mike News. And Liz, do you want to introduce yourself quickly, and then we'll move down the line?
I like long walks on the beach. I like films and television and Netflix. What should I say? I cover mostly issues that relate to women in politics. I've been at Mike for almost 3 years, this coming March, and I host a web series called Flip the Script, where we sort of look at different kinds of social issues and try and approach them in a fun, accessible way.
Thank you. And next to Liz is Genevieve Roth, who is a Senior Special Projects Director for Glamour magazine. Genevieve?
Hi guys, I'm Genevieve, and if you remember anything today, it's that I am from Alaska. It's the only thing I really like to talk about. But I run special projects at Glamour, which is everything we do that sort of sits at the intersection of philanthropy, what we do internationally, politically, all of that stuff. The Women of the Year Awards, we have a girls' education nonprofit called the Girl Project that we're really proud of. So that's my thing.
Thank you. And Laia Garcia is Associate Editor at Lenny, which was recently launched. Laia?
Yes. Hi, I'm Laia. So I'm from Puerto Rico. I was born and raised there. I am the Associate Editor at Lenny. I'm the art director, and I also helm the e-commerce store that we just launched yesterday. And before that, I have been a freelance writer and stylist. And I just bought a TV, which I put in my bio because it's a big deal. Thank you.
And Latoya Peterson, who was editor and owner of Racialicious, among many other things, and recently produced a fantastic series on girl gamers.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm Latoya Peterson. I've been a member of the Racialicious community since it was called Mixed Media Watch back in '06. I now own it and edit it. I'm also the editor-at-large for Fusion, where I was working on the Girl Gamers Project, which is a social documentary on kind of women who make games, why we do it, why we love it, what happens with it. That's kind of an answer to the narrative and the single story I started seeing about women in gaming being just harassed and nothing else, when there's so much more interesting things to talk about, so many more interesting things. I've written for a ton of different outlets at this point: Washington Post, ESPN, New York Times, a bunch of places, I don't know. And I have been a geek for most of my life. And it just so happened that when I grew up, people started getting very interested into these very geeky things that I was into. Like comics was suddenly a thing. Video games was a thing. And that's how I got my career.
So thank you. So we're here today to talk about the tension of doing the work that we do, writing the things that we write, producing the videos that we produce in a mainstream environment that remains, I would say, fundamentally hostile to the idea of women's equality and intersectionality as an important way of looking at the world. And so the first question I have is really the question that is described in the agenda, which is, do you think it's possible to have mainstream feminist media? Sitting at the table here, we have people that are working in a wide variety of spaces and approaching that problem from radically different perspectives. So if we can start, actually I'm going to start with you this time, at this end. If you can talk about that from the perspective of the work you've been doing.
I think, just like most trends in media, feminist media and the desire for it and the support for it waxes and wanes, right? So we get these great eras, like I came of age in the 90s, where suddenly like it was cool for women to be angry on the radio, and it was very interesting to talk about societal problems, and every library was fairly well stocked with stuff like Manifesta and other like huge feminist works, and people weren't afraid to say it, and they weren't afraid to like be very vocal and voicey, and even in the advertising in that area, in that era, in that time frame. You saw all of this feminism that had been just imbued into the culture, and then it just kind of vanished, right? It receded. And so you start noticing, particularly when you've been around for a while, that there's an ebb and a flow to what media thinks is important and what happens. And normally, as soon as you start getting comfortable and you feel like yes, we've hit peak feminism, or we've hit peak racial awareness, and it's only going to get better from here, that's when the backslide starts. So it depends. It depends on how committed we are as a culture to telling the stories of women, right, and whoever should identify as a woman, and to also figure out who is going to fund that, right? Can it exist in a capitalist structure, which will require certain things? We'll talk about that more, I'm sure, a little bit later. And then once you have your feminist ideals, particularly if you go like me and move into management, how do you advocate for that in a structured organization that is not set up to deal with your ideology, be it feminism, anti-racism, anything else? So there's a lot of different complex factors, and I think it really depends on the cycle that we're in.
Yes, I agree with what you said, but I do think it's possible to have feminist I hate saying content in media, but I think what's important is to acknowledge that it's a gradual change, and to acknowledge that not everything needs to be everything to everyone at all times, especially if we're, like, I guess in some way Lenny is a mainstream publication, even though we have backing by Hearst, but we still feel a little bit outside it. But for example, with like women's magazines and publications like that, I think it's important to acknowledge that their rate of change is going to be like a lot slower, and that we should also celebrate the little things that happen, not holding them accountable for the things that they're not doing, but it's important to also, because I feel like with the feminist, with feminism in our culture right now, sometimes it can be a little bit negative, where it's like, these aren't the things that you're doing, and these aren't the things that you're lacking, and everybody's waiting to jump on you for the things that you're not doing right, instead of supporting the things that you're doing.
So the path you walk on is narrow.
Yes, very narrow.
Genevieve?
I think my short answer to your question is yes, right? Like, I absolutely think that you can create feminist media in all environments and in a mainstream environment. And as the person on this panel who probably works at like the bully pulpit, right, related to that kind of thing, do I get to engage in content that I feel like empowers women? Every day, right? Every day. And do I feel like I get an opportunity to use that bully pulpit to advance the idea that women and their issues deserve oxygen and airtime and power? Every day I get to do that. And, I think I'm sure we will talk about at some point in this panel is the context. Right? And I recognize that when I go to work at Glamour every day, I don't believe that the girl who was sitting in the hair salon in Toledo is reading the magazine because she thinks she's going to understand how to use her voice to make a difference. I get that she's going there for lipstick, but she's going to leave with information about how to register to vote. And she's going to leave with information about what's happening to girls in the developing world and why they're not finishing their education. So in my path, I've gotten really comfortable with the package.
Have you seen that evolve in the time you've been doing it?
Totally. Yeah, and I think, Latoya, what you said about the landscape kind of going in ebbs and flows is completely true. Like, I think there are probably a lot of women here who also work in the philanthropic space, and like, there are trends, right? When I started in women's magazines, which, fun fact, I spent the first 6 years of my career in men's magazines and said out loud a number of times, drunk and sober, that I would never work for a women's magazine ever. And now I worked at Glamour twice and lots of other publications. And there are trends, right? Like when I got into this space, water was like the hot thing in the philanthropic space to talk about. And now all we're talking about is Girls Ed, and I'm so psyched about that. But I actually believe that we're in an exciting moment to talk about women's issues, and we are getting oxygen. And how I actually see that, and we'll also talk about this, like, I see that financially. I see that in what advertising partners are coming to us with and the kind of content that they want to be supporting and celebrating. So from my seat, I think it's a nice moment.
Yeah.
I have to agree. The only reason why I ended up in media is to do feminism and to do feminist media. And in my experience at a new media outlet, that was driving all of the traffic. Like, that was driving all of the shares from social media because most social media users are women. Women are really driving conversations, and you'll see that in end of year, when we look at the best performing stories, often those are stories written by women or written about women. So Zach Cheney Rice, a writer, one of my colleagues at Mike, actually looked at the 10 most highest ranking stories on the New York Times in 2014, and what he found was, all of them, the top 10, at the exception of like a quiz. I can't remember what that quiz was, the like big quiz in 2014 that like drove a zillion views. But the exception of that quiz, it was all stories written by women or written about women. So I think that really is a powerful thing. And where we're seeing, the only place in media where we're seeing actually a majority of women, because overwhelmingly newsrooms are still male and white, is social media. Social media is the only place where there's actually more women, and women are inherently really good at social media and good at using it, and finally being listened to and using it to uplift their voices and the voices of other people. So I also, I was on a panel. The BBC put on this conversation, is news failing women? And someone from the audience said, well, women are just less interested in complicated policy topics. And I think there's this idea that culture, lifestyle, makeup is inherently fluffy and stupid and objectifying, but that sports is not. And so I think often the type of media that women consume is devalued, like most of the things that women do in society. And so I think we have to be careful not to sort of do that to ourselves. Even though I do agree, capitalism, this could be a whole panel in itself, the way that it can oppress women, but I think I've just been really optimistic about the future of media, especially over the last 3 years. And I was at the Glamour Women Awards, and I just had chills all over my body. I thought it was one of the coolest feminist experiences of my life. So I'm very optimistic.
So here's where I respond to the question my daughters asked me, which is, as I was gathering statistics to share with you today, if this is why I dressed like I was going to a funeral. So I'm not going to read off a lot of statistics. Thank you. I agree with you that it does not necessarily mean that I'm feeling overwhelmingly pessimistic. But despite the activity and the work that we're all engaged in this sort of efflorescence of feminist media production, the statistics about media are pretty startlingly, persistently grim. And so newsroom demographics haven't really changed since 1992. So 65% white and male still. That's true even more so in technology, oddly enough, even though the internet is very democratizing and we tend to dominate social media platforms in terms of management, production, editorial direction, framing, photo selection, all of that, sad but true, despite our efforts and I think some remarkable work, stays institutionally bound. And so the question that I really want to ask is a two-part question. One is, how have you seen the internet shift these dynamics on the ground, not necessarily in institutions, but in terms of audience dynamics and the sharing of information? And two, what have you seen, or what do you think would be fundamentally disruptive? Because I agree with you, Latoya, like, I'm old enough to see these cycles of backlash and retrenchment over and over again, and you really see it. You see it happen, and you see the erasure of these stories, and they may come back, but the frustrating thing is that they tend to repeat, and because we're not teaching children feminism and social justice in the classroom, they learn it all from scratch all over again, only if they're driven to seek it out. So we're not really here to talk about education, but can you talk about the internet democratization and disruption that is represented by feminist media?
Who's
Anyone?
starting?
I mean, I can start. Yeah, so I would not have a career without the internet, right? My voice would not have been heard. I am not traditional. I am not establishment. I didn't go to school for writing. I didn't finish college, all right? It was literally me blogging through Racialicious and gaining attention and finding editors that wanted to publish my work. One of the first places I was published was Bitch Magazine, right? It was they published one of my first pieces. The American Prospect, which was at that time, the deputy editor was Anne Friedman, who you guys might know her work as well. They both commissioned me around the same time, so I forget who I got my first writing credit from, but both of them, right? And so the internet has been this thing that's just broken down walls, right? You don't need to go through the traditional gatekeepers. You don't need to go through the networks that people had. It took me forever to realize that a lot of people in media were getting there because like their parents were good at media and therefore they kind of got this job. Or like I knew someone and this is my college homie and I'm just going to give them this writing gig even though they might not necessarily be the most qualified person. It took a while to realize those types of relationships were in effect and then how to figure out how to counteract that, right? So at first I was just like, this is amazing and it's great and, like I have this wonderful career and I'm really happy. And then I started noticing this weird thing when I turned 30, right? I'm 32 now. When I turned 30, suddenly it was like my peers started peeling off. All of these brilliant, amazing women I was writing with, we were blogging with, they started to move on. And a lot of it, like if you look at it on any individual level, right? It was not that big of a deal, right? One person, they want to take a break from blogging because they got burnt out because of the harassment. One person, her job outside of writing picked up and she didn't have time for writing anymore. One person kind of got burnt out on the feminist blogosphere, left, But what you start noticing is that your male peers are getting positions and posts at the New York Times, and they're getting their own branded sites, and they're getting, write-ups in Variety and in the New York Times, things like that. And these women who are their equals, if not sometimes their betters, we're not getting that same kind of shine, and we're not getting those same types of opportunities thrown their way as just by right. Like if everyone would go and read Ava DuVernay's speech at Elle, it's amazing. And I'll just summarize quickly the point that I really wanted you guys to take from that, where she's talking to another white male director that she met around the same time. They both had movies that debuted at Sundance in 2012. She won Best Director and Jury Prize for Middle of Nowhere. I don't think he won anything, right? But they're more or less sneaking around, they're peers, they like each other. And she tells a story about them catching up a few years later. And she goes, I had this great big deal come through. They gave me $20 million to make Selma. And the guy, it's just a generic white guy, we don't know his name, all right? And he's like, yeah, I know, I had a deal come through too, it was cool, it was $150 million. Right now, so this is not just about women not being interested in things and women not stepping up, right? This is about the types of opportunities that people see you as ready for. This is about what happens when Liz, who has an awesome series and she's driving traffic and she's doing amazing stuff with Flip the Script, will they trust her to run HBO Go?
Right.
Will they trust her to run these things?
I'll do it.
She's like, yes. Right. She's leaning in, and I'm really, really happy about that. But at the same time, we also have to be really strategic about power structures, right? And how power is cemented. We have to be strategic about funding. We have to be strategic. It's one of the reasons why I went into management. All right? If it wasn't something I wanted to do, I like being a creator, I like being a writer, I like doing the things I want to do. But I started trying to learn how media works because when it comes down to it, you want to be able to pay people who are amazing writers. I know so many writers who were better than me, who did amazing work, and they just had to stop. They had to stop for financial reasons. They just had to stop. And they did not get the same opportunities. They couldn't hold out long enough for the ship to come in, essentially, right? And when you get to a point where you can say, well, wait, I want to hire people. Like, I want to build a team. I want to look at what this is. I want to be able to change things and transform things. You start realizing how narrow the band actually is and figuring out, okay, so what do we need to do structurally, right, as feminists? Because it's one of those things where it needs to be kind of a concerted offense. This can't be something that we hope will happen better. It has to be something that we plan for, right? To figure out how do we make sure that the gains that we fight for now will be enshrined into the culture, will be there in 10 years for the next generation, will be there in 20 years.
I also would say that I would not be where I am without the internet. Like I said, I grew up in Puerto Rico. I went to school in Philadelphia, and then I was like, I want to work in magazines, so I moved to New York, like everybody does. And early on, like my first year here, I realized how important connections were. I applied to a job. I will say what it is because it was a long time ago and there's nothing bad about it. It was a job at Oprah magazine, and it was an entry-level graphic design job, which is what I have a degree on, very useful. And I sent in my portfolio, and I got a call from the art director. And she was like, oh my God, I love your book, because you send a book. She's like, where did you get this made? It's beautiful. And I said, oh, I did it myself. She was like, it's incredible. So how did you, what's your connection? How did you hear of this job? And I said, oh, I found it online. And immediately she said, oh, okay, well, I don't think this is gonna be right for you, but thank you very much for getting in touch. And it was then that I was like, okay, so this is like, you like my work, you are impressed by it, you pick up the phone to call me, but how do I get past that last step? And that's when the internet, not like I was like, I know, I'll become a blogger, but I think that's how I know that it's become such an important thing. Like, I actually started a fashion blog. It sort of started my whole like writing career, oh my God. So I started a fashion blog when blogs were like not a thing that people cared about. It was like late 2005. But back then there were only a few people doing fashion blogs, and immediately like we found each other and we became a small community, and that's how I met Tavi, who was doing like Style Rookie back then, and she, and then through that there was like a giant, a growing network of young women who were really young. They were teenagers, I wasn't. Who all were like blogging and sharing ideas. And so when she started Rookie, we had a pool of girls to pull from. And so it is this community that came from online that has expanded now, that I find really refreshing, and I think it will help in the future, because there are so many events that I find myself all the time where there are literally no men. And it's all women who are writers, who are editors, who like do all of these kinds of things. And we're all consciously trying to pull each other up. And I think that those networks, even though they started very small and sort of random, I do think that they're growing, and they're going to be like the thing that makes sure that like the changes that we're doing now that stay in the time going forward.
I think a couple of things. I think in terms of how has the advent of the internet, or sort of the proliferation of it, helped sort of move feminist issues forward at Glamour, I think it's great for coalition building, right? And so when there was a moment in time when we, like one of the first things I did at Glamour was a story about rape in the Congo with Eve Ensler, and we put that out there, and that tree didn't fall in the woods. We actually raised tons of money with it, but the difference is that now we could also raise tons of followers, and we could do an Instagram campaign, and it gives us the opportunity to create a dialogue with our readers, which has been great, and it is a great equalizer in that way. In terms of what it's done to the industry, what these guys are saying is 100% true. It like flattens a really complicated and narrow system, and both Laia and Latoya are talking about a difficulty with access to networks, right? And that I know that woman at Oprah, and I totally know her. No, she did the wrong thing by you. And I think when you're in it, and when you are the art director at a magazine and you have 500 applicants, you learn to trust your network. And you want to hire the person who comes from the person that you trust. And so what you guys have both just demonstrated here is that the internet allowed you to create a network, which allowed you to create a path that you could follow. Here's where I get worried about what the internet has done, is that it's fucked the economics of all of it. Sure. So people who deserve to be paid really well for their work, and who used to be paid, $1, $2, $3, $4 a word for their content, are now having to settle at $25, $50 a post. And I can't put my head around that. Like, I have no idea how to fix it, but it drives me nuts. And I don't know how really smart writers who are getting airtime, like you're talking about, keep their lights on, because we don't have sites that figure out how to pay for that content. So that is a new worry of mine.
Liz?
Sorry, I said fucked.
It is fucked. So I, as many have said, would not exist, or I would exist, I'd just be doing something else if it wasn't for the internet. The first piece I ever wrote was linked to a Change.org petition, and how I became a campaigner was through Twitter. Literally, Change.org tweeted me like, do you want to start a petition? And I was like, okay. And that was like my 9th tweet. And then I applied for a job, an internship at Mike Online on a feminist job boards. And it was sort of a great experience. So I wanted, so many interesting things have been said. I think that the way that I've seen anyway, like for me, feminism is not just like like when people are like, oh, it's just a hashtag or you're doing hashtag activism, I'm like, look at all this evidence of the opposite. I think, just to name a few, like when I became very aware of the impact that we had was during the Wendy Davis filibuster, when like not a single news media outlet was covering it. CNN was talking about blueberry muffins. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people on Twitter were watching the live stream and were sending in pizza and cookies to Texas to support protesters and to support Wendy and her filibuster. And the next day, like, it was on the cover of every single newspaper, and every news outlet who was not talking about that was not in the conversation. We've seen it happen time and time again, and I think it's helped us create better media and criticize mainstream media. The most recent example is, what happened, the horrible, horrible tragedy in Colorado, with the criticism of the New York Times calling him a gentle loner, and then immediately deleting that. And the way that we talk about terrorism, anyway, I think there's just fascinating examples to me that show the way that social media has really changed the conversation. But to Latoya's point, I think it's totally maddening to see women contribute and drive so much traffic. And traffic, your clicks are worth so much money, you have no idea. You're making so many people rich, but all of those people are men. So that's the issue we need to fix. And to your point, a lot of the people at the top who are starting media companies, who are owning media companies, are white men, and we have to create cultures that sort of disrupt that and allow not only more people of color in newsrooms, those figures are really disappointing and depressing, but we don't just need more people of color and more women in newsrooms. We need them to be going at the top and to be determining cultures and elevating other people, so that there's this interruption of this meritocracy, so people elevating and helping those who look like them, which often benefits white, wealthy men.
So that gets me to this issue of perspective and objectivity. As feminist writers, we are often categorized, portrayed as people who have no objectivity, bring a specific perspective to the discussion. Liz was on a panel a couple of weeks ago. Were you the only woman on the panel?
What panel?
The one where
Which
I
one?
tweeted you, where the man asked you what the audience should know about your perspective, and I tweeted you default man.
Wait, I don't remember this.
CNBC. Liz was on a panel and she spoke, and then the moderator of the panel said, I think you were the only woman, there were three men, and the moderator, and after you spoke, he said to you, what should the audience know about your perspective?
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, there it is. That's the idea, that she must be biased because she's expressing feminist viewpoints. And you said something like, well, as a millennial and a woman, and it was not a question that he would ever ask someone. And I think as women, we're often asked to write from our personal pain or personal experience, and that we don't have access to that neutral space that is, it's the subjectivity of white men becomes our neutral objectivity for culture, which is something that we're constantly pushing against without necessarily doing it consciously. And what it strikes me is that, as you said, we have to get into the hierarchy of these organizations so we can change them. And it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about media or tech or banking. there is a very stubborn institutional wall that is inhibiting diversity. And one of the things that strikes me as media makers is that we do have this voice. I feel like I may be repeating, but are there ways to change the way we use that voice by calling on our readers and our audience? Because one of the things recently with the shootings in Paris was this argument that we get the media we want. And we grow up in a culture that marginalizes our voices and our experiences and our bodies. So men and women both have a preference for what men have to say. And for men as leaders, whether it's in a media environment or in a political environment. What can we ask our audiences to do that might, because I feel like I'm constantly just engaged in raising awareness. You know, if it was like 1972, it would be, you know, a consciousness raising session every day. Everything I write, I think of as a consciousness raising session. But are there explicit asks we can make? Because you're talking about clicks, and we know what the economics are. The economics are pretty ugly if you're trying to just make a living writing. Are there things that we can engage people in doing that would help make the economic argument within institutions, or frankly, a moral argument? I've never really understood why a lack of diversity is not a matter, I hate to use this expression, of journalistic ethics. Why is it not unethical to portray only one perspective? So are there things that you think audiences could be doing differently? Because we sort of rely on them to apply pressure on corporations.
Well, I think the internet is really the place where that happens. Like how you said, like nobody is covering the story. It goes viral for X, Y, Z, and then everybody else just has to pay attention. They don't have the choice to ignore it. So I think that's sort of the only thing that we can, since everybody is in social media, is to just, you know, you have to tweet, you have to support. And I've seen, I can't remember exactly what magazine, but if there's like a magazine that doesn't usually feature a person of color on the cover, you have to actually go and purchase it, because your money is what tells people, like, we should keep this going. So it's what I think it is important for our audiences to be engaged, and ultimately they're the ones that are, I mean, they're not the ones with the checkbooks, but they're the ones that have that sort of power. Is you have to continue to get them engaged, and that's where social media, I think, is also really, and the internet are really changing the way everything is approached, because I think even the resurgence, the fact that we are speaking so much about transgender issues, for example, I think it feels to me very connected to work that had already been happening on the internet, and you just talk about it and eventually everybody else. Like, even if one person does it because they want to be edgy, which is a dumb thing, but it happens, and everybody else will pick up because everybody wants to be in it.
And I think before we put too much onus on the audience, and I think they absolutely have a responsibility, and everything you've suggested they do is really smart. Like, there are a lot of really small decisions that we can make. You know, as journalists ourselves, we can be very careful to make sure that when we're the person with the pen, that we have a variety of subjects. There are a multiplicity of voices in our own stories, that there are, you know, I mean, I don't have a huge team, but I'm really careful when I hire my team that my team looks like America, right? Looks and feels like America. And that's, we can talk about that later. That's actually not the easiest thing to do. You have to work really hard at it. But I do think, you know, we have some agency, right, as content creators, sorry,
Right.
dirty word, to just like get it right from the bedrock, right?
I think the question to me, I mean, I think there's a lot happening at grassroots level. I just think the higher up the organization you go, the fewer women you see, the fewer people of color you see, and those numbers haven't changed in a long time. They're really persistent, and so you know, there are no easy answers. It's really hard work to be, and I think too, there are people who will fall on the sword of saying, hey, I'm going to be the outlier here. I'm going to be the one who makes the noise. And we know that people are penalized for advocating for diversity within organizations. Mm-hmm. So it really comes down to education.
I think, too, it's important to remember how big the internet actually is.
Right.
Right? I feel like people a lot of times they say, well, everyone is talking about this. No, 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 everyone in your circle is talking about this.
That's
okay?
right.
No, 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 no. So, because of most of my work revolves around inequality and how structures work, right? And it doesn't matter if I'm writing for a financial section, like I'm doing stuff for Fusion's Money section. It doesn't matter if I'm writing about race. It doesn't matter if I'm writing about class. A lot of these things have these similar webs, and you can look in different pools and see different stuff, right? What everyone's talking about on Twitch is not what the feminist blogosphere is talking about, right? It's like totally different. You can ask somebody something that everyone in feminism knows. No one in video games knows that this happened, and they don't care, right? And so I think a big part of it is, one, figuring out where these pockets of influence are. Because that's the thing, right? Like right now we're measuring influence through like almost like blunt tools, right? Clicks, engagement, allegedly. Sometimes people say impact. But something like the dress is always going to be way more popular than like Syrian political policy. Like that, they are not ever going to compare. That's not ever going to happen, right? And when you make a lot of stuff, like a lot of the content that we push, it's great and it's fun and it makes people feel good and it's very, very popular. But there's also a space for the content that people create that has to do things that's not going to be sexy and popular, right? Financial reform is never going to be sexy and popular, right? But it impacts, 36 million people that we could be doing more for. And when I go into those types of spaces, right, these things aren't getting written up on feminist blogs and they're not getting discussed and they're not driving tons of clicks. But, I live in DC, I don't live in New York. I'm not in the nexus of media, right? And I like that in some ways because it gives me a different perspective. DC is a power center for a different reason. So like one of the most popular shows in DC until fairly recently was Meet the Press. Meet the Press never got on Nielsen ratings. Do you know that? Less than 200,000 people watched that show. No. But
Oh my God.
You have to be more than 200,000. Yeah, you have to be more than 200,000 people watching to be ranked on Nielsen. Okay? So less than 200,000 people watch that show every Sunday, but you know who does? Lawmakers.
Right.
Everyone, and now they watch different stuff, like the Sunday morning shows are battling it out, right? But those are the people who are watching it, and what gets said there becomes law, right? And you have to kind of understand what these spaces. I just sat in on a finance committee thing that was happening with Elizabeth Warren was trying to get like this campaign for postal banking office, so she lended her star power to it. And literally, like this is a room of 50 people, and they're trying to make a policy that's going to impact 36 million people. It's 50 people who are making this decision. They heard this one author from some random university's book, and that's what they're building the policy off of, right? So we need to look at also like these tools and corridors of power, right? Financial reporters tend to overwhelmingly be men. Right? People who are writing about what they call like hard business, overwhelmingly men. And in some ways, like, that's why genre has become so big recently, right? Gaming is suddenly, they're like, well, this is a $1 billion industry. Esports, right? It used to be geeks, now they're like, oh wait, there's money in it. But again, that kind of respect isn't being conferred to things that are coming for women, right? Romance novels bring in billions of dollars every single year, and no one talks about them seriously because, oh my God, it's genre, it's gross, right? Well, who wants to touch that? So understanding kind of like, I think, pockets of influence and how we leverage those is super vital to move forward. Now I've forgotten what the original question was.
No, that was good.
I was going to tie it up, but I forgot now.
It's perfect because I like what you're saying very much, because I think that one thing we don't, as sprawling global feminist people, do is leverage these small world networks really effectively, right? If we could string together small world networks more effectively in strategic ways, I think that would do a lot of good, which doesn't necessarily help within an organization, but maybe across organizations. I know that I want to make sure we do have time for questions. But we're going to wait just a couple of minutes, if that's all right. I wanted to ask if we all deal with a broad variety of media now, and in an extremely photo-intensive environment, very different from 15, 20 years ago. And I personally think that that shift towards photography and video was maybe not an overall net good for the fights that we're fighting. A lot of that comes from work that we've all engaged in that involves harassment. The more identifiable you are, the easier it is to harass you. The more likely it is that biases and discrimination will kick in. So can you talk a little bit about backlash against feminist work, against anti-racist work, and how you deal with that? Because I think there is a real emotional tax that we pay for doing some of this work. And we don't often talk about that, but I get a lot of young women who come to me and say, hey, I really want to do this, and can you talk to me about it? And often I think, okay, this requires a certain type of resilience and stubbornness, and not have people burn out, either because of harassment or because they're not, it's not worth the small amount of money that you can make doing this work. Do you think that harassment, I personally think the kind of harassment we encounter those are political acts. They're political acts that we don't really categorize that way.
I almost quit my job because of the comment section. So I started as an intern, and then I was offered a position, and I was like, I really love what I do, but we had no moderator at the time, and so I would sift through, when I would get home exhausted from writing all day, I would feel the obligation to go through the comment section and delete rape threats and horrible comments. And the first time I wrote about guns was when I really realized too, the intersection of feminism and guns is it opens up a really crazy box of really horrible, nasty, violent people who organize on other platforms, by the way, to organize and then attack you online. It's like they're very organized. They know exactly what they're doing. They're not just idiots who we're just supposed to ignore, and it'll be fine. So yeah, and even this week, last night, I was sick, lying in bed, and at 10 p.m. my phone rang, and I answered even though I didn't know the number. I almost didn't, but I was like, oh, maybe something is wrong. And then it's a guy who is, I don't even know how he got my number, which I'm still trying to figure out. If anyone knows why my number is online or how to find it, please let me know. But offering me a job, just going off his crazy, and then just like talking to me, and I didn't know. I was like, I can't be mean to him because I don't know what he's going to do to me. I don't know how much information he has about me. Anyway, so it's a real thing. And I'm very lucky to work at a company that really understands and listens to our voices. When I said, along with other women working at the company, that it was creating a hostile work environment, and we actually got rid entirely of the comment section, which I think is great, and we can have another debate about that. But even recently, the CBC, which is the largest broadcast company in Canada, I saw this last night, has decided to delete comment sections under articles about Indigenous people because the comments were that bad. And so it's terrible.
Right.
It's a terrible world out there. So yeah, you need to, now it's kind of okay. I've developed tools and a support system, and I don't read Twitter mentions anymore, which is a shame, but that helps. And yeah, there are certain topics that I unfortunately stay away from because I know not to.
So that's interesting, though, because I've spoken to many women who say that. I'll continue to write, but I'm not going to write about X because it's not worth it to me.
And even writing about harassment is one of those things.
Writing about harassment is definitely one of those things.
I am sort of wonderfully invisible in my job. I write every now and again what's important, which is why if you do Google my name, the first thing you get is like a really ugly piece about somebody didn't like a story I did on Chelsea Clinton. So that's okay. Like, I have a tiny bit of experience with it. But what I can say is that when Glamour does make a bolder choice, we get a lot of feedback about how glad we are we did it. Like, we just honored Caitlyn Jenner as a Woman of the Year, and we make a lot of bold choices around who we're going to celebrate and honor. And frankly, I didn't think that was a particularly controversial one, but we had every day hundreds and hundreds of people saying that they were going to kill her, how they were going to kill her, what they were going to do to Glamour, what they were going to do to everyone who was involved in it. And I have never been prouder than to, like, second time, do it. To just go forth and make that statement. And I'm psyched to engage in a dialogue about people who don't agree with our decisions, but I am not even a little bit prepared to engage in a dialogue about somebody who wants to inflict physical harm because they don't agree with a decision. right? So maybe the question is like, how do we continue the dialogue, which is healthy and controversial, and stop with this like horrible backlash that is a crime. You know, you're right, it's a political act and criminal.
I guess I haven't really had a lot of experience with online harassment, luckily, mostly because I haven't ever really written about, like, I think there is, like, my work is inherently feminist because I am, but I don't usually sort of outwardly write about it. But when I first started working at Yahoo Style, which is where I was before I started at Lenny, one of my first freelance assignments was to cover this video of this girl who was pretending to be drunk walking down the street in LA in the middle of the afternoon, and like she's asking for help, and the man obviously tried to take her home. And it was weird because looking at the video, I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is fake, but this is my first freelance assignment. Like, I don't want to be like, actually, I think this is wrong. But I also felt like the point of the videos was correct, whether or not that was like a bunch of actors or whether or not it wasn't. Like, that's probably what would happen if you're a drunk, attractive, like blonde woman walking down the street in LA trying to get somebody to give you a ride home. So I wrote this piece about it, and it was the only time immediately people came at me, like on Twitter, and I would get emails. And what I think is so strange is on Twitter, it's just people calling you names. And I guess since it's not something that I have to deal with every day, I laughed it off, and sometimes I retweeted them if I thought they were particularly funny and they're like how dumb they were. But there is something still when you see it where you feel your inside sort of shrink and you get warm inside. Because even though I know that it's not about me and I want to believe that they can't physically hurt me, I know that it can happen to other people. So even though you block and you mute, you still sort of carry that with you for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't think there's a way to like get around it. Like, men are garbage and they will continue to be garbage. And it sucks that like we have to deal with that, but at the same time, I don't think that that's any difference in just like being a woman in the world where you just have to put up with garbage from men all the time. So it's sort of the price that comes with just being a woman that exists in the world.
I think about this less in the online world, right? I was blogging before social media was really a thing. So it was comment sections. We had a lot of targeted attacks from white supremacist groups. It's a very different animal than somebody that's like, it's weird. To me, in my mind, there's a distinction between someone targeting me based on something that I said or my gender or whatever, and somebody feeling like my race should be exterminated off the planet. Like, to me, those are different things. And so it's hard for me to engage in that portion of the conversation. One thing I will say, though, is that a lot of times when we have these conversations about women harassment, we don't talk about in the workplace and we don't talk about the state, right? And those are, we talk about it as if like it's personal. It's like, oh, if I wrote something different or whatever. But like sports journalists, right? Getting access to athletes a lot of times means walking into this minefield. There was a well-publicized thing. Remember this a few years ago with the reporter that wore tight pants, the white tight pants?
Yes.
And there was a whole thing about whether or not that was proper for her to wear, period, to be in the locker room, if she should have expected to be harassed, if she had known what was going to come, right? She's in there doing her job. She's a courtside, ringside, courtside, was it football? Courtside reporter. Right, she's doing her job. But there are people who work in her organization like that did not say anything, did not stand up for her, and did not say, that's not okay, like she's a professional, she's doing her job. They let it pretend like she was a groupie. That's a problem. I have another friend who was kicked out of China for spying because she was being a journalist. I have a friend who I met years ago, and she was threatened to be killed by her government. But of course, like if it was a male colleague, it would just be killed. Because it was her, it was, we're going to rape and then kill you. Right, and it becomes this whole other thing. There's places where my friends want to report and they're like, we don't think you should send a woman journalist here. Right, which automatically sidelines it. Like there's all of these different aspects to it. A woman journalist I know, Melissa Cornick, one of the first times we met, this was when I was very young, I was just starting out in journalism, like 06. And she was telling me, and she was like, these young journalists these days, she said totally casually, she's like, they don't even know when the police have infiltrated one of their meetings. And I was like, oh shit, was I supposed to know that? Like, is that like, is there a manual that I'm supposed to be reading right now? That's scary. And like, Liz, I wrote a whole thing on Fusion about like your identity online and how easily it is for people to find you, right? And I did a whole thing about it for Fusion. You can also check the Crash Override Network. But I mean, like when I was researching that article, like I literally got the Anarchist Cookbook a copy of it, because these are the techniques that people are using
Yeah.
to find you. And then you need to figure out a strategy that allows you to feel safe enough to continue to do your work, but also understanding that there are inherent risks with just doing the work, period, right? If you're saying anything of import or of substance, you're going to be attacked. That is the way it is, right? You are going to piss somebody off, right? That's why reporting and journalism is a job, right? You train and you learn that this is what I can be protected from, this is what I can't be protected from, this is what's going on, right? Two, you learn that if you don't stand, right, that's when the most atrocities happen. It's happening where people are not looking, right? I went down a rabbit hole the other week trying to figure out this whole like hedge fund Puerto Rico thing. And suddenly like you're looking and you're like, this is a huge humanitarian crisis. And you're going, wait a minute, you can trace this all the way back to like these 3 policies that they were like, yeah, that's cool, let the hedge funds just buy up the old defaulted funds from other countries. This is not going to be bad at all. It's totally fine. Right? Like you can see like where this is happening and where it's impacting like women on a grand scale, people on a grand scale. And yet like there's almost no conversation. And if women aren't in that space, right, if we're not seen as having the chops to do the big stories, to do financial reporting, to do, you know, these stories, we're not bringing our perspective to it, right? A lot of men don't even ask what's happening to women on the ground. They don't care. Or they assume that because the narrative isn't written that it doesn't exist, right? We have to tell our own stories, which means we have to be there and we have to show up and we have to be bold to do so. And that's scary as shit, right? One of my friends is writing, Elizabeth Mendez-Berry. She wrote this piece in Vibe called Love Hurts, which is all about domestic violence in hip hop. Yeah. And she wrote about Big Pun, and she wrote about DMX and a couple other people. And she received death threats and rape threats from artists who were actually still working in the industry for more than 6 years after that article was published, right? But that article rocked hip-hop. That article made change. She doesn't regret it. She lives in a neighborhood in Jackson Heights where a cartel shot a journalist to prove a point that they had enough. Do you know where it is? Do you remember the name of the journalist? Because it's failing. But yeah, the cartel shot the journalist to make the point that we can get you anywhere, right? It takes a lot of bravery to step up, right? I love pop culture. I love content. I love genre. I love all of that stuff. But there is real shit happening that we need to be reporting on, right? One of my friends writes for Vogue so that she can report. Yeah, thank you. She writes for Vogue so that she can report on poverty in Arkansas. Vogue pays the bills so she can go do the work that she feels like matters, right? And we have to look at that because in the click economy, the only thing that matters is the thing that you can sell.
Right.
But in our world, there's much more that matters, and we need to be very strategic about how we support, we fund, we work.
Yeah, and I think a theme we've seen a lot of this year is, personally, I think we just really have to be more forgiving with the people doing this work, with the women doing this work. The standards, we're just held uniformly to stricter, narrower standards for how to say things, what to say, what to talk about, who to talk to. And it just affects our day-to-day lives. It affects our work.
Can we unpack that really quick?
Yeah.
Because I want to go back to something that Laia said, where at the very, very beginning, where you talked about like walking this very thin rope because like everything has to be everything to everyone. And I want to unpack that a little bit because I feel like that's such an interesting thing because we all pour ourselves into our work and we work so hard and we make it, and then to get criticism back is really painful. And really disheartening because you're like, I'm trying to do this thing. It's better than 90% of the crap that's out here, and it's just getting, criticized all over the place. At the same time, right, I'm thinking, it's very fresh in my mind, Suffragette, the movie, right? And how, like, immediately, particularly for women of color, I wrote a piece about it. There was an awesome piece somewhere else that was basically like, I am not talking about this movie. And it's because, if we're selling feminist media, and, we talk about selling it specifically, this is a thing for all women, and it's a thing for all people. And then to say, I strategically actually left out a big chunk of a woman's story because I felt like this didn't fit the narrative. And to say that to women that are always dealing with that, it's something that's super harmful, super hurtful. So it becomes this weird tangle. Like, I'm a black woman. My identities are not in conflict with each other. They're in my body. They're here. We're not in conflict. But I feel like a lot of times we enter spaces where people are used to siloing. Well, this is feminist and we should all be happy because it's
Right.
women and we're supposed to support women. And maybe we said something racist, but you should totally just be okay with it, like roll with it. You know, that's a problem. She's like, yes, that's a problem.
See, but I think it's funny you bring up suffragette because from the moment that I saw the trailer for that movie, I was like, oh no. Because do we need to know that story?
I think we do. I mean, I think...
Don't you think everybody already knows that story? Like,
No.
No?
No. Well,
Oh, okay. No, I
Well,
mean,
now
that's
they know
fine
it a
then.
certain way.
No, because to me, I was like, oh, you're telling, like, I was like, oh, well, like, votes for women, Mary Poppins. Like, these are the women that got women the right to, for white British women to vote. But I feel like that's the story that everybody knows. Like, I want to see a movie that, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah,
maybe people don't know that story. But to me, I was like, again.
I like
don't know.
Suffragette, and I say in the racialist piece I wrote about it, I was like, I wanted to like this movie so bad. I was coming like, well, just meet me halfway here. Because a lot of people, the history that we're taught is sanitized, right? It rubs out anything that they feel like is going to be too controversial or too scary, right? If you look at slavery, look at how they teach you slavery. They're like,
Right.
black people just got picked up on a boat and they were lazy.
They
We put them
imported labor in
bit of-
Texas.
Oh yeah, in Texas. Laborers, right? Like we could have just rolled out anytime, no problem. You got your walking papers. And most people don't realize like how graphic and how horrific things were. Like that scene in the trailer where the woman is like putting an iron on a
yes.
man that's like trying to molest her. Like, you know, like people are hardcore back then. But a lot of times they write that out of history because they're afraid of, if you tell the truth, then what happens, right? It's this very, very scary thing. So I'm not saying that the movie isn't necessary and it's not wonderful and it's not great. But you can look at something like that and go, okay, there were women of color here. They were present. But there's not a note, it's not addressed to the movie, you know, and I just made a documentary, right? There's a ton of stuff that I left out that I couldn't fit in. There's a ton of stuff more representation that I wanted that couldn't be in there. And you can address this because you're the creator, right? You're in a movie, like you can get in front of this. And what I saw, even sadly from a website that I love and that I've been supporting for 7 years, was this, well, you should just accept it anyway. Like it's not good this time, but maybe the next one will be there, right? And it's just like, just understanding what you're asking people to do. Right, I feel like when we approach with humility and we say, we're telling a story and we're telling it in a new way, we don't know if we're going to make it just right yet, but come with us. I think Makers did this really well, right, where they were like, we're looking. Like I knew about Makers 2 years before that thing came out. Yeah. And they were like, we're looking, we want to know, we want to see, like who should be here. And they really tried to roll that out in a way that was inclusive, right? I watched Jessica Jones, mainlined it, and like even though the only black character really doesn't have a lot of speaking roles. You know, he's missing for half the series. And Malcolm's a drug addict. But I still felt very included in that world, even though the main storyline is about a white woman, it's a white woman friendship. But I still felt included. I still felt like I loved it. I still cheered for her. I cheered for Hellcat. I was all about this. And I will show up for season 2, right? Because you don't have to be like, okay, like this is, I'm not asking you to be like ridiculously inclusive. I'm saying don't be exclusive and then call yourself being inclusive. Right. Like that's the thing. And I feel like that's where a lot of these blow-ups happen. Yes, there's a lot of pressure on feminists. As soon as you label yourself, same thing with anti-racists. As soon as you label yourself, people are going, you didn't live up to your ideal. You're supposed to be this and you didn't do that. And it's effed up and it sucks, right? Because at the same time, they'll go out and spend, you know, $25 on some rapper that's drugging people. And that's fine, right?
Right.
But, you know, let it be like, anything that's feminist and it might have a weird smell to it, then it's like, okay, this is a problem. But I just feel like we want to unpack these things because there's a lot of different issues at play.
So I do want to take some questions. There's one thing I want to say about that though, because we have to keep talking about money and advertisers and advertising. And the same complications that you just described, the same kind of, well, what do we do when you have multiple things going on at once? Dove comes to mind, Dove's Real Body campaign, and you know, in India, Dove sells skin bleaching products. That's what they do. That's like their #1 seller. But Dove funds all kinds of initiatives, and so I feel like a lot of the times as feminists, we are on hyper alert. We have to be, especially globally, when you look at the way these large corporations are functioning all over the world, you know, and well, that's a whole other conversation. But we have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
So I really appreciate
I'll start. I think I feel very lucky. Lenny, where I work right now, it's like a dream, honestly. We don't depend on clicks right now, so we are able to, our editorial process is, hey, this is a cool idea, cool, have somebody write it. It goes, we pay people, I say like good money. It goes on the newsletter, we send it, and there's no like, well, this story didn't click a lot, so like, let's not do it next time. So I feel lucky about that. And that is related to intersectionality because I think we can cover, or we try, and I think we've been doing a pretty good job so far to cover things from a lot of different perspectives. And personally, where I've tried to make a difference is I hire all of the illustrators that work for our stories, and I've made a point to try to hire more women of color, which is hard because it's not always the people that are reaching out to me, and I really have to go on a deep search to get these people, and sometimes it's a problem because sometimes people disagree with things that Lena, who is our owner, or like has said, and they don't want to work with us, which I respect, but on a certain level, I think sometimes you should take the money and do the work, because at the end we're putting you out there. But so that's kind of how I personally try to bring more different voices and more points of view in the work that we do.
I listened to the Body episode that Lena's podcast is, Women of the Hour, which is teamed up with BuzzFeed, and I have to really say it's a wonderful podcast. I was really happily surprised by the intersectionality of that specific episode, and I've heard a lot of really positive feedback about it. I don't want to like ruin it for anyone or give you spoilers, but it's really good, and I think does a really good job. I think at Mike, we went from having sort of a feminist vertical to an identities vertical. I think and that was, I'm not taking any credit for that. That was Sam Meyer, who was my editor when I started there. And she really wanted to expand the idea of identities and intersectionality. So, and how being a woman is not just being a woman, you have many other things that are at play and that affect your experience. So, and our team is very, very diverse. I can talk more about sort of the initiatives that we've done at Mike and the openness that leadership has had to those conversations. But we've really, millennials are the most diverse generation in history, and we want our newsroom to reflect that. And I think our identities team looks like America, and I think that's a model for our entire newsroom too.
In terms of, I've been criticizing race and feminism for 10 years, 8 years. And so there's a bunch of archives you can go to. I think the main issue that comes is putting your idea of identity politic over other people's lived experiences and expecting them to like it. That's generally where the problem's coming, right? It's not necessarily like, I'm not mad at privileged white women for being privileged white women. That's cool. I am so happy that was your story. Like, I wish I could have grown up privileged. I grew up poor. It sucked. I don't want to do it again. I don't want my kid to go through it. Like, I'm like, no, right? So when I meet somebody, like I had the luxury to meet Sheryl Sandberg. She's fucking awesome in person. I don't expect her to get my struggle. I don't expect her to think about that stuff. That was not her reality ever, right? So I wouldn't expect that necessarily from her. I would expect her, though, to listen. I would expect her, though, when she's building something. I remember when she was launching Lean In, I happened to be in California, and she invited me, and she was talking about it. She was like, oh, God, I was so nervous about the chapter on women of color. I just didn't know if I was doing it right, and I asked my best friend, and she's black, we've gone back to college, and she knows me too well, and I don't, like, this is Sheryl. She's just, like, going off. But just the fact that she cared enough. Because I've met feminists who are very well regarded, who have amazing work, who have not cared. Who have come in with their second wave swagger, and they're like, well, this is your life, this is the way it is, all right? Yeah, it's a thing, right? And they're just like, look, I already know your story, kid. You were poor and you're black, and I know exactly what your life is. Like, whoa, lady, hold on. That's not how this is. But I think that this practice of humility is tough for everybody, right? It doesn't matter what the organization is, what the system is, right? We're in feminism, so we're always like, oh my God, feminism, right? When I quit the feminist blogosphere, I was like, feminism is the worst. I can't deal with this right now. I need to go somewhere. I'm going to go into like math and be a feminist. I'm not going to deal with this shit no more, right? But what happens is you see that everywhere, though, right? Anywhere that there's a clique of people with an affinity, there's going to be fights, there's going to be war. I'm studying the histories of civil rights movements. Langston Hughes wrote letters the way that we write tweets. Like, literally, they had, like, the selected letters, it's like 400, and they were like, there were thousands that we found, and many more that we wouldn't, right? And it's like, his diaries are like, it's like the feminist blogosphere wars all over again. It's clapbacks, it's people betraying each other, it's people who were fake civil rights agitators. Like, it's amazing to see, like, you go back in history and they're just like, you know, they're telling their friends in France, and you can't believe what Zora did this week. This always happens, right? This always happens. But the way that we mitigate it is by being really humble, right? Not assuming that intersectionality is a label. I wrote a whole thing on the Washington Post about this one. Like, intersectionality is not a label. It's not just a thing that you're like, this is my brand, I'm an intersectional feminist. No. Like, it's an action. It's a thing that you do, right? And by realizing that you don't need to be a scholar in anybody's identity, but rather try to be a friend. Try to listen. What does it mean to make somebody that you're with feel comfortable in the world, right? I am terrible at trans issues. I understand some trans rights stuff, I understand trans history, stuff like that. Like, I'm not great, I never talk about it, I never try to do it. But I was asked why there were so many trans people in this documentary that I made about girl gamers, and I was like, well, the trans community is 2% of the indie game community. Black people are 2% of the indie game community. That's a huge population, like, period. But more importantly, I have a friend named Naomi, and I have a friend named Maddie, and they are fucking awesome. They write beautifully, they do amazing work all the time. Maddie wrote a thing about tea, I'm still thinking about it. It's been a year. I'm still thinking about that post that she wrote about tea. It's tea, right? Like, she writes about racism, but she did a whole thing about, like, tea. And I was thinking about it, and I'm just like, she's not getting her due. God damn it. Like, it's not fair. It's not right. It doesn't make any sense. I don't need to understand any more than that, right? And I don't need to do anything to be like, you know what, Maddie, like, can you be in this documentary and lend your voice and talk about your expertise? That's all I want. That's all it is, right? One of the things I always love about Gloria Steinem is that she shared space a lot. And she toured with Flo Kennedy, and she did all of these different things to boost people and to say that, okay, well, maybe you don't get the shine that you deserve, but if you're with me, then, like, I'll do the best that I can, all right? Who else did this that was famous? Marilyn Monroe. She did it to, who was the jazz singer?
Thinking.
Yes, I know exactly
Yeah.
what this is.
Yes,
but
I
don't
can see
remember
it.
Yeah, Ella Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
And she sat and she was like, I'm going to book out this club, I'm going to sit in this table every single night
Yeah.
that you have her. And it will bring people to your club. I will spend this for you. I don't think Marilyn Monroe was a huge civil rights advocate, but you have your friend and you go and you ride for your friend and you have their back. That's all you really need to do.
One more question. Yes, you were waiting.
Not really a question, but I was listening to, I was getting a little sad when you were talking about the problem with men and the corporation and all these controlling factors I talked about. So I wanted to step in and offer hope and a potential pathway to solving some of these big problems and needs, not just intention needs. So I'm a scientist, and I'm a quantum physicist, and an inventor. And what we haven't really looked at is what's driving a lot of these men isn't the men, it's the data that they use, all right? So a lot of decisions are made by calculations today, data models. And the good news is they're not working. So the tools that we've used corporations to predict growth, they're futile. They are not getting results. So the average inventor, the average is 5% success rate. That's nothing, okay? So why is this exciting for us? It's exciting for us because the man's system is failing. So why lean into that broken system? And I'm going to tell you why it's extra exciting. So I just finished something with 10,000 girls, Princeton physicists, and we show that man science has an error. That error came because it left out the feminine intuition, which is actually part of vital science. Every part of the economic system, every part of the prediction algorithm, what drives Harvard, what drives policy is broken science. And we are finished that. That's why if we have to look at that, there is a truth that we can fix. And that's actually the next evolution is looking at models, their models are not working. And if anybody's interested in how to fix them, we fix them by understanding nature better. And that is what we ended up proving is within women. So there is a hope, and the answer is within us. But we have to sometimes think about that these men too are products of broken thinking that have been with us since many, many years.
Yes, thank you.
And we don't have to hate on them.
Thank you so much. Is there, do you have time for one more question?
I think we have time for one
One more
more.
question, anybody? No? We're good?
There's one
Oh,
more.
yes, hello.
Right, I just wanted to address something that's come up a few times around the panel. And that is what I kind of see as like a tension between this new media economy, right? Like the internet is this wild frontier where people who occupy marginalized identities can have a platform and form connections and say their piece and kind of, participate in conversations in that way. But also, as pointed out, the click economy isn't necessarily economically viable. And I'm just kind of wondering if there's any tips or advice that you guys can provide to somebody like me. For example, I'm a woman of color, I'm a writer, I'm a freelance artist. I just decided that I was going to be a writer a year ago.
Congratulations, I'm sorry.
It's a great new world that I'm participating in, but it's also, like, the struggle is real. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any response to that.
I can say a few things about that because I did. It does bum me out a lot what has happened to the economics of the life of a writer inside this transformation, right? Like the same woman I know who made a viable living writing books with relatively big advances and publishing stories in magazines she has to actually just produce a tremendous amount more content now to pay the same bills. I think that's without refute that has changed. I don't know how I feel about the shift I'm about to identify to you, but it does talk a lot to what you're talking about, which is that the new media is really far closer to advertising, sponsorship,
Right.
and content than the old media ever was. So I used to know 0 people who worked in my advertising department and none of the people who advertised in the pages of Glamour magazine, and now I collaborate with those people on the regular. And that's a shift that's come almost, they've just been riding on the same horse, right? And so what that means is that there are more jobs around brands and content that are still putting out really interesting content that actually pay viable salaries than there used to be. I kind of think that that's where the money's gone. That you can do that, you can have the same thing, right? You can have the same job, you can write, you can do sort of produce content in the way that you want to, but pay bills because you're closer to brands. I really don't know how I feel about it, but it is something that's happening.
Right, it's a corporatization.
Yeah.
Okay, so we always say gloom and doom stuff because we're at a panel, we have to be realistic. But honestly, like, writing is awesome as a career. It's a really big privilege to be able to do things that you feel like matter and that you can share stuff with people and like people are impacted by your work for you. Like I wrote this thing called The Not Rape Epidemic like 2008, right? And it was a big deal then, but like somebody just emailed me and she was like, can I translate it into Spanish? Because I feel like it would like do something like, oh my God, like somebody cared enough about like this work and they felt like it was important enough, not only to share it, but also to translate it and like to put that work in and effort in. I was like, yeah, please I just want to post it in Spanish. Like just, you send it to me and it's cool. Everything is fine. So it's amazing, right? I feel like no one should ever tell you not to do something because this is our life. You get one, right? You get one. Maybe in the last panel they might have talked about other ones, and I'm sorry if I'm not being inclusive.
Then you get another one, then you get another
Right.
one.
I came in at the end of that one. I was trying to catch up with the womb. But it's this really fascinating space that we're in right now. But again, like I said, everything is cycles, right? So when there's these busts, there's booms, right? Right now, media is in chaos, and it's because we don't understand what, this guy named Dan Willis said, 2009 Southwest. We're looking for a grammar of the web. We're looking for a way that the web fits together, and we don't really know. So right now, everything is breaking, right? And in some ways, it's awesome for those of us who would be normally be outside of these power structures. But it's terrible for people who are used to them or are used to things working a certain way or are used to like $4 a word. I was like, dang, like the best I got is $2. Like that's amazing. Like that's a new goal for next year, $4 a word. But It doesn't mean not to put yourself out there. It doesn't mean not to try and experiment. The only thing, like if my son was like, I'm going to go into writing, well, he's a son, never mind. If one of my homies was like your age and was like, I want to be a writer this way, how do I do it? I'd be like, save your money, get really, really good at your money. Get a second trade, all right? Have a dual skill, right? So that way if writing doesn't work out, like I have been moving into digital and product, right? And then management. Because I was like, it's a adjacent thing, right? It's something else I can do. I can do UX pretty well. I'll work it out. Get your trade. 3, try to hold out. Because what will happen is that this will calm down. And then people will figure out how to make money again. And then we'll have another big sweep into the boom period. And then we'll have a bubble and then we'll have a bust, right? Media right now, we're going into like this weird bust, right? But it will rebuild in the same way that like all these things will rebuild, right? We'll figure it out. We'll figure a new way. And maybe that new way just isn't here yet, right? We didn't have Facebook 10 years ago. We didn't have Tumblr 5 years ago. We didn't have Twitter 10 years ago, right? And these things have dramatically changed how we work as journalists, how we work as media makers, right? So just hold out for the change, right? Your time will come. That's all I want to say.
Yeah.